simplest form of joint is a butt joint, and that's what I'm going to show you how to make. A butt joint is a square end on one piece of wood which butts against the side of another piece of wood to form a corner. It's often used on very small pieces of wood where it would be impractical to cut another sort of joint, and for simple boxes and frames. It's obvious that the end of this piece of wood must be absolutely square in order to butt accurately against the side of the other piece. You may be lucky enough to receive wood that has been sawn square on the saw already, like this piece. But if you have a piece of wood like this, which is not square, or you need to cut your wood to length, you will need to mark and saw the end accurately. I'm going to show you how to do that now. The first task is to square at one end. I already have one end squared, and then to measure the length of the box. I'll make mine 200 millimeters long, so I shall make a mark 200 millimeters from the square end. And using the tri-square, and it is important that the stock of the tri-square is held firmly against the edge of the wood, slide the tri-square along so it is in line with my first mark, and draw a pencil line across going through the mark. That will enable me to saw square across the side of the wood. In order to cut it square through the wood, I'll need to make a line across the edge using the tri-square, and then across the second edge. I do that once again by making sure the stock is against the wood and sliding it along until the blade is exactly in line with my first line, and then making my pencil line. It's important that this is done accurately. Even the best woodworker finds it difficult to make a good joint with poor marking out. Then cross-hatch the waste. This will help me saw accurately when we come to the sawing. That's it, marked out, ready for sawing. And to saw, we'll need a bench hook fixed securely in the vise, a tri-square and a marking knife, and a saw. I'll use a tenon saw. You may also use a dovetail saw, which looks exactly the same, but is a little smaller. Before I can saw across the line, I need to cut through the grain with a marking knife. Place the point of the marking knife in the line, slide the tri-square along until it touches the marking line, and cut across the line once or twice. I'm using the point of the marking knife, and the marking knife is upright in both directions. Now we're ready to use the saw. Now this is a skill that is easily learned if you follow these instructions carefully, and it will enable you to cut very accurate joints straight away. Place the wood on the bench hook against the stop of the bench hook, and try to saw as close to the end of the stop as you can. The saw is held almost as if it's a pistol, with a straight wrist and trigger finger pointing forward. And looking from the front, it should form a straight line along the saw and up your arm with your elbow close to your body. Start sawing on the corner furthest away from yourself, and saw with the saw against the end of your thumb. I'm sawing on what we call the waist side of the line. I'm trying to saw away half the pencil line and leave half the pencil line on the piece of wood that we want. If I saw at one side of the pencil line, then my piece of wood would be too long, and if I saw through the line or inside the line, then it'll be too short. This is called sawing on the waist side of the line. Once I've made my saw cut, I can begin to saw the saw level across the face of the wood. Notice that the line goes across the wood, but is not very deep. I can then continue to saw through the wood. If I'd start to saw level straight away, the saw would skid about, mark the wood, and wouldn't saw accurately. Now I need to cut right through the wood, and I have a line to guide me. I can see one on this side, which will keep my saw straight through the thickness of the wood. Notice that I still have my wrist straight, my elbow near my body, with the saw straight. I can keep sawing even if I saw a little into the bench hook. The bench hook is there to be sawn into, and it prevents damage to the bench. Now if I've sawn straight and well, the end should already be square, and I can check that with a tri-square. That should require no further cleaning up in order to make my joint. If on the other hand I'd not managed to saw it square, then I'll need to clean up this end so that it is square. Now, the two ways we can't clean it up are the two ways that you're most likely to attempt to clean it up. That's either by filing or glass papering. We could use a sanding disc, as long as you have permission, or a shooting board. When we have our wood square, and I'm only demonstrating on one joint, of course, in a real job there would be at least 3 other joints to form a box or frame. We're ready for gluing. We can only glue, but it's very difficult to hold the wood square and steady while we're clamping, so it's a good idea to add some nails as well. If we use ordinary nails, with or without glue, there's a likelihood in wood as thin as this, they'll split the wood along the grain. And certainly, if we just nailed it with no glue at all, the joint would be very weak. We therefore use panel pins, and in very thin wood, such as this, we use even narrower pins, which are called veneer pins. These can be used with or without glue. I want my panel pins to go into the wood halfway through the wood, so I'll need to measure half of the thickness of that piece of wood from the outside corner on the second piece of wood. This will be called a nailing line. So I shall measure the width of the wood. This wood is 14 millimeters wide. Half of 14 is 7, so measuring from the end of the second piece, I'll mark 7 millimeters, and using the tri-square, draw the nailing line across the face of the wood, and obviously I'd do this on the other 3 corners if this was a box. As it's not a very wide piece of wood, I'll use 2 panel pins. If we put these panel pins too near the edge of the wood, again they'll split the wood, so I shall put my panel pins 10 millimeters in from that edge and 10 millimeters in from the other edge. I can now glue and nail this together. It's a good idea with a butt joint to start nailing the nails into the first piece of wood at each of the joints before you put the glue on. I'm using fairly long panel pins, and I'm using a small hammer called a pin hammer. I'm also going to slope the panel pins towards each other. This is called dovetail nailing, and it prevents the joint from pulling too easily apart. Place the nail exactly on the mark, lean it over a few degrees and begin to tap it in. Try and make sure that it's upright in the other direction, and if you're satisfied, continue nailing until it's almost through the wood. You can hold a second pin against the end to check that. Remember to lean the other pin in the opposite direction. I can now apply a small amount of glue to the top of my second piece of wood. If you apply too much, then you can remove it with your finger. And then it's most important to position the joint very carefully. I've got to hold the joint so that the corner is exactly in line. That's this part of the joint, so that these two edges are perfectly in line. I'll just reset this up in the vise, being very careful that the joint is put together accurately. I can continue to hammer the pin into the second piece of wood. It's a good idea not to hammer too far so they can be pulled out if the joint is going wrong and re-nailed. You'll notice that I'm swinging the hammer from my wrist rather than having to use the muscles of my arm to exert the force. You can now continue. Just before finishing the hammering, take it out of the vise and check that everything is satisfactory, and if so, then complete the nailing. Try not to bruise the surface of the wood with the hammerhead. Now, I don't wish my panel pins to be seen, so I'm going to punch them just below the surface, and then I'll be able to fill the holes with wood filler, which will leave the pins almost invisible. That then is a glued and pinned butt joint in a fairly typical size of wood. If we were using small wood such as this, there's a major problem of the wood splitting if you try to nail it. Even when I use very narrow panel pins called veneer pins, the only thing you can really do is to take two pieces of similar wood and do a test joint to see whether it will split or not. Position it carefully and hammer the veneer pin home. And you can see, in this case, it hasn't split, so I would then be able to assemble the real frame.